Hello everyone, I'm Mike Connors, and welcome to How It Ticks, the go-to podcast for anyone with a spark of curiosity about the inner workings of Switzerland. Hosted by yours truly, an Australian expat with a deep curiosity, How It Ticks offers a platform where listeners are invited to explore the vast landscape of Swiss culture, business, innovation, and tradition. Each episode features a one-on-one interview with experts and thought leaders from various fields, providing a panoramic view of what makes Switzerland tick. If you are like me and you enjoy listening to successful people share their insights, this podcast is for you. My guest today is Melanie Häner-Müller, an economist specializing in social mobility, income inequality, and economic policy. She leads the social policy division at the Institute for Swiss Economic Policy in Lucerne, focusing on Switzerland's welfare system, pensions, and education, where her research is featured in major media channels. She also teaches at the universities of Lucerne and Basel and writes a monthly economics column for NZZ am Sonntag. How important is social mobility, and where does Switzerland stand compared to other countries around the world? You'd assume nations with stronger social policies have greater social mobility, but that's not always the case. And why is the perception of income and wealth inequality so different to what the data actually suggests? In this episode, Melanie and I explore the relationship between social mobility, income distribution, and economic opportunity. We break down Switzerland's unique position, the key forces shaping mobility, and why the wealth gap continues to widen. We also clarify the differences between absolute and relative social mobility, two concepts often misunderstood in public debate. This is a fascinating look at how money, opportunity, and perception shape society. Now, here is my conversation with Melanie Häner-Müller. Melanie, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to How It Ticks. How are you?
Hello, Mike. Thanks for having me. I'm fine.
If you are in an elevator and you have 30 seconds to explain to the person next to you what you do, how would you summarize it?
Well, I have a job that is really fascinating because I can do research on stuff that interests me in everyday life, but also as a researcher. More specifically, I'm investigating the chances of moving up the social ladder, so social mobility research, and also how income and wealth is distributed in Swiss society.
Okay, you've prepared that. You've thought of that before. How do
No.
you... Before we go into this, I do want to ask you a lot about social mobility and the social ladder. How do you define that exactly?
Well, usually when someone thinks about social mobility, you are mainly focusing on family background influences, right? So how influential for your own success is your family background? So how similar in terms of social status are children and their parents?
Now, I know you've studied social mobility going back all the way to the Middle Ages. When you
Yes.
look at that data, what is one of the more surprising things that you've discovered?
Well, I thought that back in the late Middle Ages, things have been completely different so that social mobility is never comparable to nowadays social mobility. But actually, what we found was kind of a cyclical pattern with times where social mobility was higher and then other times when social persistence was higher, so social mobility was lower. But I couldn't have guessed that actually there is this just a cyclical pattern, but on average we still find like pattern and also the influences of parents, grandparents, and great grandparents that follow a specific pattern. So, what we found is that the social or like the family background influence vanishes within 4 generations. And that's also what we know from everyday lives. And like there is this proverb, right, that the first generation builds something, then the second tries to still keep it, then the third generation is already on the way down, and the fourth generation has nothing left at all. And this is exactly what we found in our data set, more or less on average. Like there is a strong parental influence on one's social status. Then the grandparental effect is about an additional half of the parental effect. But then when it comes to great grandparents and more distant generations, we do not find any statistically significant effect.
For generations, I'm just thinking, do you have every single family is moving completely on their own different timeline, or are you actually finding everyone's moving together?
No, so there is, I think like this is very important when it comes to social mobility research. It's about swapping places on the social ladder. So, yeah, in order for a family to move up, there needs to be a spot on the top, right? So there needs to be a family that moves on the same time downwards. And what we found is that you actually see this pattern in every generation for different surnames, and that's probably also what people would wonder: how can you get data back to the Middle
Mhm.
Ages? So, do you have income data, or what kind of data makes it possible to trace families back over 15 successive generations? And what we have is we have a surname-based approach, so we basically count surnames. How do we count them? We count them in the elite group. So, for example, among students or other political elite groups. And then we count them also in the overall broad society, meaning that we take birth registers where we have every newborn for comparison. So that makes it possible to compare every family's surname representation in the elite and compare it to the overall representation in society. So, if, for example, we have one specific surname, such as Marian, and it makes up for so like uh, 1% of the newborns are called Marian, but 5% of newly enrolled students are called Marian, then the family Marian would be overrepresented by the factor 5 in the specific generation. And we do this for every surname that we can find in every generation's data, and then we can compare the over or underrepresentation of each family across generations.
That's interesting. So, what are some of the most privileged or successful surnames?
Well, as we are focusing on Basel, there is this famous Dijk families. So, for example, Burkhardt, Merian, Stechelin, Fischer, and so on and so forth. But even among them, there was always kind of swapping places. So it wasn't the case that, for example, the family Burkhardt was at the very top the whole time. So even among elite families, there was swapping of places, but still, I have to mention that we have a more persistent elite than overall society. So social mobility patterns are higher in overall society than in elite groups.
Okay, so when you said before that there is this 4 generation cycle, so even when
Mhm.
this cycle's on the way down within these elite groups, it's still higher than the average.
Exactly, exactly.
Do you does that tell you something? Like what do you take away from that information?
Well, for me, it was interesting to see that there is no dynastic effect on average that we could see. For example, if my great grandparents would have a direct effect on my social status, even though I've never met them before, that would be a sign of stickiness, of dynasty effects. And so it would be just enough to have the right surname, right? And fortunately, this does not seem to be the case in Switzerland. So I would say this is good news because if we are looking, and this is what is usually done and what we do also in other studies, just at the parent-child relationships, then that means that we cannot really be sure where do those resemblances stem from. Is it an institutional problem, or is it just similar talent and similar efforts that they both spend? So it's always very difficult to assess the equality of opportunities only based on parent-child relationships. And so that's why we opted for this more long-term approach, because there you can really derive potential dynasty effects.
Is the opposite true? Do you have people or families in the bottom percentile which are basically stuck there as well?
That was not part of our focus. That would be very interesting. And for other countries, for example, Gregory Clark did this also for prisoner data. So we just have the overall society data and the elite groups, but we did not collect data on let's say, groups of lower social status, such as prisoners. But that would be interesting to find out. What Clark and co-authors showed in their studies is that the stickiness is true for or observable for both groups at both tails of the social status distribution, so the elite and the very bottom families.
I wanted to linger on that 4-generation piece of information again. So even though we have all of these other international global events going on, especially now when there seems to be another global event every week, you'd think everything else seems to be accelerating. So based on that data, there doesn't seem to be anything disrupting that. Or are there breaks in that cycle based on other historical events?
Well, this kind of cyclical pattern we can best investigate when we just focus on parent-child, so like 2-generational relationships. And if we focus on that, we see such a cyclical pattern, and we work together with historians to find out, okay, what characterizes those peak times where you have very high social persistence, so very low social mobility. And what we could find out was that usually in times of crisis and wars, you observe a high stickiness, and thereafter you have an increase in social mobility again. And this was found before when it came to inequality matters. So it is also called like the great equalizer, right? So wars typically also affect income and wealth situation of people, and may be an equalizer or have an equalizing effect. And that's what we could also show is true for social mobility as well. So that in terms of crisis and wars, sometimes you also have countervailing force, so that social structures are disrupted, and then you have opportunities again to move up the social ladder. So you have more dynamic societies in the aftermath of crisis and wars. And this is what we could detect also for our data set.
So if we look at Switzerland, I suppose in the last 100 years, there hasn't been any drastic war or something directly impacting the country. Can we still use this information to sort of look ahead into the future for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years? What can we learn about that? How can we apply it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that this cyclicality is observable, but it is also not massive. So I would be rather optimistic that we really have this long-term stability. And so I would also look optimistically in the future that this possibility of swapping places might also work in the future. So I think like when we talk about the future development of social mobility, people are, and there is also evidence on that people are worried that you do not have in the next generation the same opportunities that, for example, your parents used to have. And I would say, like, this is very important to note because this is another form of social mobility we are talking about. When I am investigating the effect of family background on your own social status, I am interested in this swapping of places on the social ladder. So this is what we call relative social mobility. But nowadays also media debate, public debate are also worried about whether on average the next generation can be better off than the previous ones used to be. And this is what we call absolute social mobility. And of course, in times where we have already very high incomes, very high educational social status, it is it becomes more difficult to really be at this margin and push more forward, because if everyone has basically a university degree, then the next generation can either have also a university degree or be lowerly educated, right? So that means that in terms of absolute social mobility, there might be a tougher time to move forward, but that does not affect the equality of opportunities.
Hmm. Oof, I have a few questions. How? What are the data points which define social mobility? So you said education, but there must be more than that which define
Yeah.
where someone sits on the social mobility ladder.
Yeah, that's also very crucial when we compare different studies, also from different countries, because we, from research, would definitely recommend to always look at different indicators of social status, because they might be or they might reveal different extents of social mobility. So usually, people are looking at educational status, at incomes, at wealth, occupational status, maybe even political representation.
Mm.
And for some countries, those indicators show very similar mobility results. And for others, it clearly makes a difference whether you are looking at income or education, for example, in the case of Switzerland.
Mm. That's true. So how does Switzerland differ from some of its neighbors? Say we take Germany, for example, which, without knowing more about it, I would assume they're very similar. What would some of the differences be?
Yes. Yes. So in Germany, actually, the social mobility rates are lower than in Switzerland, especially when it comes to income.
Mm.
In Switzerland, we have very high income mobility. And how can we assess high income mobility? Maybe an example is helpful for that. So if we are looking at how much of the income can be explained by family background, then we have in Switzerland the number of 15%. So 15% of my income can be explained by my parental or overall family background. And this is not much. So even like, for example, the Danish society that is quite familiar for being very mobile, they show a number of 20%. So there we have 20% that are explained by family background. And for example, in Germany, we have even 43% that are explained by family background. In France, for example, it's still 29%. And in the US, it's close to 50% that are explained by family background. So huge disparities. So in terms of income in Switzerland, we are very mobile. And then still, if you are going through media articles, sometimes you stumble across the explanation that we do not have equality of opportunity in terms of university degrees. And so the question then is, oh, but she just told us that we have a high social mobility, but how does that fit with this other fact? And this is very important. So that's why we have to make this distinction between income and educational mobility in Switzerland, because indeed, academic children are way overrepresented at Swiss universities. So you are way more likely to pursue a university degree if you stem from a academic household.
And that, sorry, and just to, that would, by defining academic household, that would be one or both of your parents also went to university?
Exactly, exactly. And so there is this overrepresentation. So you have over 50% of chance to also go to university if your parents have a university degree. And if your parents just have the mandatory school degrees, then you are below 15%. So there is really this huge gap in university attendance. But I think like what is then the missing puzzle piece that we also need to consider is that in Switzerland, having a high university degree or a university degree at all does not explain all the opportunities in the labor market. So, for example, in the US, if you want a very high salary, then of course you need an Ivy League degree. And this is not true for Switzerland. So yes, we do not really have those Ivy League universities, but you do not even need a university degree. So you can really make it up the income ladder even without a university degree. And this makes it important to note, so because that explains why we have a very high income mobility despite average educational mobility.
Okay, so now we have social mobility, income mobility, and educational mobility. I wanted just to ask you one thing you said about Switzerland having 15% income mobility, which seems quite low based on or very low compared to other countries, and you have the US conversely very high. Where my mind went was how correlated is access to education with income mobility. So, for example, in the US, it's very well known, it's very, very expensive, and often getting into Ivy League universities, you need very educated, very wealthy parents to even have the chance of getting to one of those. So I guess in that context, 50% can explain. Am I right, or am I missing something?
No, you're definitely right for the US. And in Switzerland, this is not the case, right? So our university fees are rather low. Of course, you cannot just account for the university fees. You also need to take into account the standard of living. So because maybe you cannot or you do not have enough time to work apart. So maybe it's difficult to really come up for your everyday life. And that's also what we observe in Switzerland. So that usually, so first thing, your parents' choice definitely influence your own choice. So if your parents went to university, they are more tempted to suggest to their children to also pursue a university degree. So this holds true for both the vocational path and also the university path. But now the big difference is that in Switzerland, you have the possibility to go to this vocational educational training. So you have this apprenticeship. So you work in the respective company and you also get a good school training. And you have later on the possibility to pursue additional degrees. You could even go to university. So you have this very high permeability of the system. It's not only about this duality of the system, that we have this VET system and the university degree, but we also have a very permeable system. And so this makes it possible that even though you have only later access or no access at all to university, that you could still have a very high salary because you are very well trained for the labor market's demands. So if you're looking at, for example, returns to education, then Swiss studies show that like the optimum in terms of those rents you could make is actually to combine a vocational path with a further training. So it's not the purely academic path and not the purely vocational path, but it's the combination of the two. So those mixed paths that promise the highest rents.
So, in general, then, it sounds like a general rule of thumb is the lower the percentage of income mobility tied to family background, the better. Why,
Exactly.
if a clear reason for Switzerland's low percentage of income tied to their family background is to do with this sort of
Mhm.
dual education system, should this be a model then for many other countries to follow? And I wonder, are there
Mhm.
other countries that you've looked at equally as low, if not lower, which are similar to Switzerland in the way they have education?
So in terms of income, we are really at the in a pole position. So it's hard to find any competitors. But in terms of education mobility, we are just average. And for example, in Germany, you have quite a similar dual educational system, but it is less permeable and it is also less used. And so I would say like it's difficult to just export
Mm,
something and then hope that people will use it the same way, right? So it's not only, so I think like this is very important. It's not only about education, but it's about the combination of the labor market and the educational system.
mhm,
So for example, if companies just hire only managers with university degrees, then of course it's quite difficult to maintain this high income mobility, this low income persistence. And so I would say like this is for now it's a big asset in Switzerland, but we have to be careful in observing the trends also on the labor market. So there is like this famous example of UBS CEO Sergio Ermotti, who did his apprenticeship in the bank and then moved up the career ladder up to CEO, right? And the question is that possible also for future generations, or is there a tendency that like companies use the the information of having people with university degrees as a proxy for higher quality labor forces?
mm. How does globalization affect these numbers? So, Switzerland has this huge amount of immigration, and part of
Mhm.
that is to do with just a flood of people, talent wanting to work here for lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
That must dilute the numbers when it comes to family and family mobility. Is that true?
So maybe we have to take a first step back, going back to the Middle Ages,
Hmm.
because there we also had a lot of immigration, especially in Basel, which was close to the border and was had multiple waves of immigration. And that was very important for our surname analysis, because that's why we needed to resample all the time the surnames, because new surnames appeared and they could also move up the social ladder. So we could not just focus on the ones born in Basel, but we also needed to take into account all the immigrant families. And we also went to historical data where you could find that people, especially the elite, was afraid that they could risk their good position, or like that their good position could be in risk because of those immigrant families, because they could feel the pressure from those immigrants who were talented, who were successful. So they, for example, also forbid that they would be in top political positions, or sometimes they try to ban or at least warn women to marry those men, and so on and so forth. So there you could really feel or see those dynamics, and that's also what we see then in the mobility patterns. So that like elite structures could be disrupted also thanks to geographic mobility, right? So like immigrant families who intervened in those more and more cemented family dynasties. And for nowadays, in a newer research project, we were looking at income mobility in total. And so we took administrative data where we basically have everyone living in Switzerland included in our data set. And for those people, we know the family structure, we know their nationality, we know their income, and so on and so forth. And what we do is based on a sibling similarity analysis, we first determine the extent of family background that is explained, or like that explains my income chances. And this is exactly where we end up with those 15%. And then we can further disentangle and try to find out, okay, what explains now this those 15% overall family background effect, and how much explanatory power do we find, for example, for the variable nationality. So that would then mean, okay, like if I have a specific nationality, if I'm foreign born, and then this explains a lot of my family background effect, right? Because this is very decisive. And this would then again be rather problematic when it comes to equality of opportunity. And what we find is, so we test for nationality, we test for parental income, we test for the place of residence, so urban or rural regions, and we also test for civil status of the parents, because we also know that divorced or married parents would might have a different effect on children's income perspectives. And what we find is, like, all those factors together do not even explain 10% of those remaining 15%. So like 90% of this family background effect is still kind of a mystery. And so this is interesting, and I think in terms of nationality, this is a very good sign. So we do, in terms of income perspective, not detect vast drawbacks if you have or if you are foreign born, which would again then be problematic in terms of equality of opportunity. But still, one wonders, okay, what are the rest of the 90% of this family background effect? And so far we tested also for a bunch of other variables, but so far we couldn't really solve this mystery.
That's really interesting. That's kind of beautiful in a way. It's just the magic about the Swiss culture seems to be immeasurable.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also, so like for now, our preliminary conclusion is that, yes, there is this remaining family background effect of those 15%, but there seems to be nothing very systematic. And so maybe like every family has the own recipe of success. So maybe there is just no systematic behind it, which would then also be, of course, good news. But in future studies, we will, of course, try to dig deeper, whether we're going to find or at least try to explain more of those remaining 90%.
Is there a difference within Switzerland? So is there a difference in the German, French, Italian speaking parts on this?
Yes, so there are regions that are a little bit stickier than others, but there is no clear pattern. You could not say, well, for example, the German-speaking part is more mobile than the French-speaking part. So there is no clear pattern. There are just several regions where you have at the moment higher or lower income mobility. But I think like this is very difficult to assess, because the question then is, how do you arrange people in the respective regions? So if, for example, the parents live in the canton of Bern and the children live in the canton of Zurich, well, how do you then assess the mobility of within Zurich, right? So there is, and we know that there is a lot of heterogeneity in that. So it's quite difficult to assess.
That's it for part 1 of my episode with Melanie, but be sure we're not done. Come back tomorrow for part 2, as there is much more still to unpack. Stay tuned.